So today we're going to be starting the first part for the first of the 39 melachot, which is the melacha of Zoreah, the melacha of sowing, placing seeds in the ground. So before we get into that, I want to describe the conceptual aspect of placing seeds in the ground. What exactly is the chiyuv? What is the isur for doing so? In order to appreciate it, we have to look at other melachot and see something that's commonly found amongst all of them. We generally find that for a person to violate the melacha, the action and the result of the action happen simultaneously. For instance, if a person cuts 2 pieces of hair from himself, generally speaking, as soon as you do the action of cutting, 2 pieces of hair are immediately cut along with it. If a person wants to transfer something from one domain to another, as soon as he does the action of transferring, that transfer has occurred. So we find that the action and the result are always matched together simultaneously. However, regarding perhaps 2 melachot, maybe a third one, but really 2 melachot, we find that the action and the result of the action happen at 2 different times. So now, we'll look at the melacha of Zoreah, placing a seed in the ground. So what we want to figure out is that, is the melacha of Zoreah accomplished when a person places the seed in the ground itself, or does it occur at a different time in which it begins to root at a later point? So based on this, we're going to see that there's a fundamental machloket between 2 acharonim, namely the Minchat Chinuch and Harav Shmuel's Starshun, which is also known as the Rashash. So this machloket is a very fundamental machloket to understand how Zoreah takes place in a conceptual level. So first off, in order to find out where else we see this, can anyone think of the second melacha in which the action and the result happen at 2 different stages?
Cooking.
Cooking, exactly. So what is the action that's required for cooking?
Lighting the fire.
Well, not lighting the fire, that's the melacha on its own.
Putting the food on the fire.
Putting the food on the fire. And then the result?
It's cooked food.
It's cooked food, or it's cooked water, it boils, whatever extent it may be. So now, since they happen at 2 different stages, we had to see regarding cooking, is that something that's dependent upon the action or the result? So in order to figure this out, there's a discussion that's found in the Gemara, Masechet Shabbat, Daf Daled Amud Aleph. And it says the following: if you have a person who intentionally places bread inside of an oven on Shabbat itself.
Bread or dough?
Yes, I'm sorry. He places dough. He places dough inside of an oven. Now, the Gemara says that before it comes to the point in which it's been considered halachically baked, which is at the point in which the outer surface of the bread has been crusted, so he is allowed to remove it. Now, even though removal of bread from the oven, back then they used to do what's known as ridiat tapat, which basically means that their ovens were built in such a way in which instead of just placing the bread inside, or the dough inside, they would have it stuck onto the walls. And by removing them, that's how it would be taken off from the wall itself. So that action is known as ridiat tapat, in which it's removed from the wall itself. And that action is assumed d'Rabbanan to have been performed. However, Chazal said that a person is allowed to violate this Isur d'Rabbanan of ridiat tapat, the removal of the dough, before it comes to Isur d'Oraita of having it baked, when the outer surface is crusted. So now, since that's the case, we seemingly find that regarding baking, or also cooking, which is really the same thing, the result of the melacha is more important than the action. Because if the action itself was just placing the dough inside, therefore he would have violated already, and then therefore it wouldn't have made a difference. But since we see that he's allowed to take it out before it becomes crusted, therefore it's only at the later stage in which he has violated it. So we seem to be making an emphasis on the result and not on the action itself. So based on this paradigm, we could try to see, is there going to be the same idea when it comes to Melacha Zoreah? Perhaps we're saying that the result should also be forbidden, and it's only when it comes to rooting that the Melacha has been performed, although it might be at a later stage, but not when the Peulah HaMelacha, or the action of the Melacha, which is just the placing of the seed. One who disagrees with this is the Minchat Chinuch. And he writes in his commentary, in what's known as the Zoreah, Sisif Katan Aleph, he says the following, that a person is chayav immediately as soon as he places the seed into the ground. Okay? Again, as soon as he places the seed into the ground, he has immediately violated it. So, this becomes quite questionable because, again, based on what we saw earlier, and the Gemara in Shabbat that says that, generally speaking, the result of the action that seems to be more appropriate to make someone chayav and not the action, the question is, how come over here it's different? So he explains it as follows. Because there's a question in halakha, how long does it take for a seed to take root? How many days or how many weeks does it take for such a thing to happen? It's a Gemara in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, Daf Yud Amud Bet, and there's three opinions in which it ranges from. One opinion says it's 3 days for it to take root, the other opinion says it takes 2 weeks to take root, and the third opinion says it takes a whole month, 30 days to take root. So now, if that's the case, if a person were to place this seed on Shabbat, and therefore it would only take, let's say, even 3 days. So how many days later it would take Monday or Tuesday before it starts taking root? And therefore, seemingly a person cannot violate Shabbat on a Tuesday. It wouldn't make sense, according to that opinion. Therefore, it must be that since you would never find a situation in which the taking of the root would happen on the same day as the action of placing the seed, you would not be able to find the situation that exists. So therefore, it must be that the action itself of placing the seed inside is what makes it an isur, and not the root. Because the rooting always takes place days after, a minimum of 3 days. And that's his source as a proof. Furthermore, on the other hand, if a person would place a seed on a Friday or on a Thursday, and only start to take root on Shabbat itself, that also would not be a chiyuv, because there's a clear Mishnah that says that as long as melachas start happening before Shabbat, it could continue into Shabbat as well. So that cannot be an isur as well. So now the question is, if that's the case, how come regarding the melacha of baking, we're more concerned about the result as opposed to sowing, which is really the action that's a problem? So the Minchat Chinuch answers this as well, and he says the reason is because the essence of the melacha of afiyah, of baking, is to having the bread baked itself. So since the essence of the melacha is to have this concept of baked bread, that the reality that the bread should be baked at that moment is what causes it to have the name of a melacha, only then is it going to be considered to have been violated. However, the situation in which a person places the seed into the ground, that is the melacha of Zoreah. That is the melacha of Zoreah properly. That just to have something sown into the ground, since that is the name of the melacha, that is the essence of the melacha as well. So whereas in one situation where we place more emphasis on the action, which is in Zoreah, and another situation where we place more emphasis on the result, that is where we find for afiyah, for baking. Now he comes up with another chidush based on the same thing, and says that even if one were to immediately pick up the seed from the ground, he would still be chayav. And it's based on the same logic, because since the only action that's required is to place it, even if you were to subsequently remove it, before hashasha, before rooting would take place, within a minimum of 3 days later, it would still be a chiyuv, because the action is what is required, as spoken previously. And finally, one more chiddush that he brings down is to say that in the situation in which a person had the intent to pick up immediately. Let's say he knew he was going to pick it up, and he just unintentionally, or he intentionally placed it inside, and he knew he was going to remove it momentarily, he would still be chayav. And therefore, in all situations, just placing seeds in the ground, whether intentionally or unintentionally, it would still be a chiyuv in all respects. So many disagree with this last point. This last point has a number of problems with it. Namely, is because there's a clear Mishnah that's found in Masechet Kilayim in the first parak that says that if a person were to place, let's say, turnips or radishes in the ground for safekeeping on Shabbat, so it says that there is no concern that a person has violated the isur of planting on Shabbat. So clearly, what we find from this Mishnah is that if a person were to place even develop foods that could also be rerouted afterwards by placing into the ground. Placing them in Shabbat is not an issue since his intent is for it not to grow. So since this Mishnah is saying that as long as the intent is not there, therefore it's not a problem. So this seems to go against Minchat Chinuch, which says that even when one unintentionally or intentionally placed it on the ground, but not with the intent of having it stay there for a long period of time, he claimed that it's Asur. But based on the Mishnah in Kalayim, it seems to not be the case whatsoever. So many people argue on this idea. Bein Achronim say that Minchat Chinuch is too much of a chiddush to understand, and much deliberation has been made on that. So B'ezrat Hashem, tomorrow we'll go on to the second part of the Machloket, which is based on the Rashash, who disagrees and says that it's not the action itself that's Asur, but rather similar to Melachat Ofeh, the Melachat of baking, it's also the result of the action, which is Asur Midoraita. Baruch Na'olam, Amen v'Amen.